Welcome to Out of the Woods, the threat hunting podcast.
All right. I want to welcome everyone to our Out of the Woods threat hunting podcast. This is our live / Discord interactive version. We aim to cover the burning topics related to all threat hunting and security stuff that hopefully everyone wants to know about, and hopefully join in some of the conversation. So just as a reminder, throughout the podcast, we'll be taking comments and questions from our Discord server. So if you're logged in there and you have opinions, comments, suggestions, just really cool insight, throw it in there. We love to hear back from you, and also got really great ideas last time when we had this conversation from our community here. So if you want to participate, make sure to sign up using the link in the welcome message if you're not in the Discord already. And just break down some quick introductions. So myself, I'm Scott Poley. I'm a senior threat hunter at Cyborg Security. Played many roles in the past, been in security for 15 some years. Check me out on LinkedIn, connect with me if you don't know me. Next, I'll pass on to you, Mike.
All right. Hey, I'm Mike Mitchell here. I'm one of the co-founders over at Cyborg. Had the privilege of working with all these amazing hunters. And I'll pass it over to Alex. That's all.
Hey guys, Alex, security engineer at Cyborg for about 3+ years now, I think. In IT cyber for almost 9 years now. Mike, you actually, I think you're the one that gave me my first job. So, I mean.
That's right. Keep it in the family. Love it.
Yep.
Yeah, so we got some fresh blood here. Alex is a good guy, so hopefully we'll hear some interesting stories from him as we go through this. Something else to mention, I'm sure you've probably seen it if you're in Discord, but we do have a themed drink we do every live podcast. This one's called the Cider Stack Overflow. Check it out, which is what we're drinking. Alex, I think he made one. I got one here. It's an Apple-ish drink. Apple-ish, is that a? Sure, that sounds like a good descriptive word. It's apple-y. It's pretty good if you like sweet things.
I'm drinking wine, so I switched it up.
So you're doing grapes. I get you. It's like the other, yeah.
Fruits. It's fine. It's fruits.
Yeah, it's fruits.
Yeah.
So with that, we typically start this off with kind of diving into 3 interesting artifacts that we find on the internet to kind of jump into some security topics to discuss. So to get that started, I'll jump into mine. And I kind of pulled it up. So if you see my screen, obviously I'm broadcasting Discord, but I also pulled up some of the things we'll be talking about so you guys can see it. But it's canary tokens. So I don't know if people are familiar with canary tokens. Thinks Canary is a really cool product where they actually build devices you can put on your network to emulate different things, kind of like your honeypot infrastructure, but they also create these software or soft tokens to fulfill numerous functionality. So if you're kind of looking in here, you can create basically documents. They have credit card tokens for a beta test stuff. They can do website-based things, SQL monitoring-based things, and what I'll kind of go into that. But they have a great document page that kind of walks through all the different tokens and some examples, and it's free. So basically, how it works is all these tokens, depending where you put them, if someone interacts with these tokens, it uses DNS to basically generate alert to whatever email address you provide when you sign up for them. So interesting example is like cloned website token. So they have a token basically that's a JavaScript, and you can obfuscate it because you can put it in your website. And what it does is every time the web page loads, it checks to see if the domain that which it was loaded from matches the domain that it's supposed to be. So it basically, you can put this on your website. So if someone scrapes your website, and they clone it somewhere else to try to do either phishing or spoofing, other types of things, it will send an alert that someone's cloned your website and put it up. You get the alert and you're able to know about that. So it's kind of a cool mechanism if people are lazy when they're trying to do cloning a website. The other cool thing that I've seen where people use it for is PDF documents, Word, Excel. where basically I think they're leveraging macros and then some JavaScript as well as in the PDF. But the same concept is if someone were to steal data from maybe a protected directory or something like that and just do it in mass, then when someone opens that, as long as they're not on a Linux machine and it's a fully qualifiable, follows the standards for these documents, it will pull down or make the DNS request, which will alert that that file has been taken or viewed, essentially. So a good example of this is I know a lot of times I've looked at malware reports and it'll talk about how the actor's exfil data, and I'm like, oh, this malware, it looks for these file types and files with these names in them and things like that. It's like really good intel to say, okay, I can't really alert on that in my environment based on the tools, but if I were to build documents that have those keywords with those extensions that are supported, I can stash those places, and if we get hit with that, when they pull those files out, if they look at them, I'll know about it. And what's really cool is when it alerts, it tells where it alerts from, so that you'll get their IP address and things about them when they're opening the documents. Some other ones that I thought were really interesting use cases, and if you, Mike and Alex, if you guys want to cut me off to chime in on any of these, feel free, because I got a couple more on a list to walk through.
No, the only thing I was going to ask you is from the defensive and offensive perspective, and I'm sure we're going to get to that point diving in with some of the use cases, but yeah, we'll wait to have the comments, but I think there's some really interesting things I've heard in the past, how this has been used, but I think some of the use cases you're about to talk to will probably highlight where my mind's going with this.
Yeah, so one of the next one I've never used, but I've hypothesized how I would use it. And you can basically do a custom EXE, where basically you give them an EXE and then they sign it. And based on that signature, when that EXE is run, it generates the same type of traffic and will generate alert every time that EXE is run. Or you can do a sensitive command. Essentially, they give you basically a registry key type thing you drop in. So if any of these commands that are being run that you want to monitor for in your environment, it can do the same type of alerting. And so, you know, one of the things I remember back in the day, there was an attack in 2017, I believe, where someone took an engineering workstation that was in a controlled environment and it had all the keys of the kingdom on it, and the attacker needed to basically leverage that, but they couldn't maintain direct connections that way. So they did a virtual or a physical to virtual clone, and they cloned the box off, made a virtual instance of it, and ran it that way to get the access to do the things they needed to do. And I was thinking, you know, for really secure environments, it would be interesting to have these kind of some sort of script or task that runs on a 15-minute interval, where it basically does like a ping, and if it can't reach a certain resource, then it runs that executable that's basically benign, but will generate that alert, so you know that that machine is now exists somewhere else, or it has maybe access it shouldn't have to the internet or something like that you can easily create these triggers for. It would be really interesting a use case. And then they have there's two other ones that I liked that I wanted to mention. One was the AWS API key. So basically, yeah, so if you have repos that have you use AWS stuff in general, obviously you want to pull those keys out, but it might not be a bad idea to push these keys in, because if anyone steals that repo or has access to it that shouldn't and tries those keys, you get notified, and then someone has access to things in your environment as well. And the last one was the SQL Server token. Basically is SQL trigger. So in SQL, if you're not familiar, you can create triggers, which are basically queues to watch for activity, and then we'll basically create an event. So it's kind of like when you build detections, but they're not necessarily for security, they're for other actions too. In this case, the trigger will generate that DNS call out when people say dump a database or do certain activities. So you can know about that as well. So it's kind of a cool use case for that. But outside of Canary tokens, one of the other things that I know people have done in the past is creating and this is outside of Canary, right? This is just doing active defense. Creating accounts in your environment that have like domain admin privileges that are active, but you put the constraints where there's no hours that account can be used, so it appears active, but it's not usable. And if anyone tries to use that account anywhere, it's suspicious, especially if they're trying to Kerberos against it or they're trying to authenticate against it, all that kind of stuff. So those are some really cool. detections.
seen
Yeah,
that?
but
No, have you seen that practice in the wild? Because that seems problematic if you have an issue where you need to use that account and you're not within that window, and you have to open it up. And I'm sure there's some controls to open that up. But there is,
no,
uh,
it's a dummy account, so it's not
right.
one that's ever to be used. So it sits alongside, like it's just a user you add to the
Sure.
domain admin group as example, and it's
Oh,
never
okay.
to be touched. Yeah.
Right. There's time constraints, but so from a defensive perspective, these canary tokens, I mean, they can be used maliciously, right, to track people as they move through sites, and I'm guessing the offensive team members could potentially use this as well. So if you're in an org, would you want to set up a monitor or detection against anything with that potential URI associated with it? So you know if you're hitting sites, and other people can pull your traffic and your information, just like pixel tracking and dropping in that like 1x1x PNG or image on a website to pull that information as you're moving through different environments. So from a defensive perspective, would it make sense to kind of track that from an internal perspective to see if any of your employees are getting exposed to these type of actions?
I think it might be. I had some experience with it where we used it, the Word token that they have, the MS Word token, dropping into proprietary drives that we wanted to watch over, like kind of like landmines. So it would trigger with the source IP and whatnot if it was pulled from a different IP than what it should have. So I can see it being used in a defense posture for sure.
Right.
Yeah, I mean the biggest thing I think I've seen is it's easy to kind of throw these things or trying to generate these things, but you need kind of IT's buy-in, because the last thing you want is to create a lot of noise for yourself just because no one knows what this is, or you've got some of this takes a lot of coordination to set up so that you're monitoring for those types of things. So that's where I've seen some hurdles. Like for instance, one of the things I wanted to set up, and it was using the Things Canary box. So we basically cloned our own. We had an external facing authentication website type service, right? And we just wanted to set up clone of that and call it dev, right? So it looks like, hey, we have an exposed dev box, and basically make it to where people can authenticate. And when people try to authenticate against that, it would pull the credentials back, so you know what credentials are being used. And we didn't need to see them, but we wanted to create a script that would take those credentials and then do a basic authentication task to see if they're legitimate. And if they're legitimate, we'd create the automatic password roll, right? So we know that credentials were exposed, someone tried them against a public facing thing that's not real. We roll that account. Now we know we're protected proactively. We know about it, all those things. But there was a lot of like, well, we can't log into someone else. And we're like, well, we aren't. But I mean, the question for me, it was always tough, was like, wait, you're not okay of us using their account, but you're okay if the attacker has their password and whatever, right? It's always that political mindset that just kind of throws me like, are we talking about the right thing, So
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned IT buy-in, and that's also a big hurdle. That could be a whole other hour and a half discussion that we could talk about. I mean, Alex and myself, coming from the background of security engineering, we had the luxury of being the security engineers and also IT. So I think that allowed us to have security posture and not have to have those hurdles of the IT team saying, oh, well, we don't want to turn this on because X, Y, Z. We could just do it. We understood the reason why. There was a really interesting story about, and Scott, I think you know this one. We might have talked about this, but somebody using canary tokens to track malicious actors that had gotten to their environment and then attack them back, which is very problematic and breaks a lot of laws. But that was one of the really interesting use cases. And when I really found out initially about canary tokens, is that they're using it for the offensive perspective to protect themselves, but also kind of like fight back and attack back those potential actors and users, which is not good, right?
Right. What's really interesting for me is if you're going to be able to get information from the host, is like, say, steals a file and opens it and things like that. Most attackers use, I combined attackers and actors. I don't know if you heard it. Most attackers, they have proxies and things in front of their key infrastructure, right? So they kind of route things through all that. But what's great is when people steal things, it comes down to like home base. So when you talk about it doing attribution, or trying to understand those types of things, if they beacon back, you have kind of a higher fidelity on like, where is this really originating from, or where is this coming from? Because you're bypassing all that smoke and mirrors because they're opening it on their own workstation if they really had bad operations or SOPs, right? So that's kind of an interesting takeaway.
Yep. But this is something that, I mean, I don't know if we have the ability to play. I mean, we can play around with it internally, but it does lead to exposing a lot of information and some things we might not want to pick up. I know we've always talked about setting up honeypots and kind of mimicking those type of environments to get that kind of information. But this is the first time I've kind of been exposed to the back end and how it's kind of operates. So it's really interesting. It looks super easy to set up, which is cool.
Yeah, and
there's a lot of complexity on the back end, right? Like what they're doing on the back end is amazing. But how they've obfuscated the complexity is really cool.
What's cool is when you actually own a Canary, even if it's just one, they give you a full portal to like manage all your soft tokens too. Like in this case, it's like you just know it's out there and it's going to hit your email, whatever email you sign up, and I don't know how easy it is to manage that. Maybe through email you can say disable or whatever.
Right.
But the interface to manage all stuff is really well done from what I remember. So it's just a really cool product, but it's cool they make this part free, right?
Right. And we do have a question about what kind of information gets exposed if somebody accesses that Canary token. And it's really just about being able to expose the IP address, location, user agents, anything that is accessible via those headers and refers, and the same kind of HTTP protocols that are kind of standard in those type of connections. But you could expose yourself, right? So it is, if you're the one clicking it or you're the one exposed to that Canary token. So you just gotta be careful how you deploy it and how you use that information.
Yeah, and then they, like for instance, they do have some things that are fast or slow, like they have a redirect that kind of redirects to whatever page you want it to. And what's cool about that is the slow one tries to grab as much information from the host as possible, right? So there's more aggressive things versus things that don't really pass as much information.
Right, and he did mention SMTP type stuff. I believe one of the examples was dropping this in HTML headers for emails, right, and baking that into graphic emails to pull information. So depending on the kind of infrastructure and where that Canary token's embedded, you could pull some interesting information out and how it's used. So, all right, moving on.
Yeah, I think Mike, you got the next big hot topic.
All right, so this one's been interesting to follow. This one is centered around the MITRE attack evaluation by MITRE Ingenuity. So this happened, I think the report came out today or yesterday, if I believe. So basically, MITRE sets up an infrastructure that allows, I think they had 31 different vendor solutions, like CrowdStrike, I think SignNet was one of them, and they posted a quadrant of how good those product vendors did against the protections against that particular attack sequence that they ran. So they focus in on Turla. So it's a Russian-based threat actor that they claim has infected victims in 45 different countries. But that was the kind of the gold standard of that tech methodology and what they mimic from an emulation perspective. And so what they would do is set up this infrastructure with the defensive hosts, the attack hosts, VPN into that system. They allow these vendors to set up a VPN profile to get in. You would set up your whatever endpoint, agent, whatever you have, and then they would bang against it. And so they're trying to track the detections against the different MITRE TTPs that were associated with Turla. And this is where things got off the rails pretty quickly. And so they're talking about, I guess what they're really trying to track is visibility, right? And so can you detect it? Do you have the visibility to detect it? Is it based on AI, ML, whatever detection mechanisms you have, did it alert? And so they claim there's 143 different sub techniques that were tested. I'm trying to find the information about 19 attack steps, 143 sub steps or techniques. I guess they were expecting 143 different detections, and then they monitored the delay in real-time detections. So that would be more of an anomalous perspective if you're looking at a bunch of attacks over a time span, and then maybe detecting or alerting based on some anomalous activity over the course of that time span. Okay, so this is again where it went off the rails. These posts across all of cybersecurity, CrowdStrike had one this morning. SC Magazine is one of the posts talking about SINET had 100% of detections across all these different attack steps. People reacted pretty strongly about these companies. I'll try to censor myself about the 100% visibility perspective. So as I dove into how they set up the lab, what their focus was, and how they measured across these different tool sets and this one very particular threat actor group, Turla, who's been around for a while, who you should have detections for. And we need to break down what we mean by detection. But people were lambasting CrowdStrike to say, okay, yeah, 100% protection. Now let's look at this very specific TTP web trail, right? Or PowerShare encoded commands, or whatever else it is. You're not going to have 100% visibility. You got 100% visibility against this one actor, Turla, against probably a very specific set of IOCs, domains, hashes, URLs. But this does not mean that you have 100% coverage against all threats in the wild, which we know is complete BS, right? And so as you continue to kind of pull back the layers of this, it's all marketing fluff. I think MITRE, I love MITRE to death, but I think in their reporting of this and in their ability to allow organizations to build their own reports, kind of did cybersecurity a disservice, right? I love CrowdStrike to death. I love these security tools. Like, they do a great job, but to claim 100% anything is
you don't see that.
Load of
You
crap.
never see that. Yeah,
Never
you never see that.
And we see it at Black Hat. We see it at RSA. We see the marketing and the copy saying 100% alerts covered, 100% detections, all this crap. Like, it's complete crap. And Scott is showing a really good breakdown of the TTPs, the attack chain phase, the lab environment that they built out. But it's so specific to that one threat. I didn't realize that as I read the initial news feeds coming in, until I actually dove into how they operationalize this whole evaluation. And it's disingenuous a little bit, right? Like, this is not across all of cybersecurity. As we know, that those detections are very ephemeral, they change. That actor has been around for a while, probably hasn't updated because they've effectively hacked 45 different countries and different organizations. So why do you need to change, right? We talk a lot about that, Scott, with the methodology of threat hunting and growing your skill set. And so anyway, that's kind of my soapbox. Really interesting to see the feedback on LinkedIn. I think people on LinkedIn are starting to get almost to the, protected by the social media, and they're starting to go after these companies and start to talk a lot of crap.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was gonna say that's one thing cybersecurity folks are great at is when they hear something they don't like as a community, they become very vocal. So yeah.
Absolutely.
So was there a clear-cut winner? Did they give the gold medal to someone in this case, or was there?
It wasn't a bake-off. There's multiple companies that scored 100%. I was gonna kind of get into what does that mean, right?
So about that. Scott, if you go to that SE Magazine link that I have, I think you sent that over to me. If you scroll to the bottom, and you're
he has this chart here, right?
There you go. There's that quadrant. The SINET is far right, which means they had 100% everything perfect. If you need a security product, go buy SINET because you're good. Just employ it.
So what's interesting when I dug into this is everyone got multiple runs against it, and they were able to reconfigure their device if they didn't pass all the marks, right? So looking at SINET, why they went so proud on this was they didn't have to do a configuration change. They got 100% without the configuration change. Some other products had to do a configuration change in order to identify get all the marks, pass whatever it was, which was interesting, right? But the thing that I kind of took away is like this measurement is not a measurement on, not that they will catch these threats, but more what can these tools do, right? Like where do they have visibility? What are some things they can detect? And so it's more about the tool's capabilities, because I mean we've all worked in environments with some of these tools, and we're not in environments that we know our own, but when you go to the dashboard you see hundreds or thousands of alerts, right? And that's the difference, being in an environment where there's other activity, that those alerts don't mean anything when there's enough noise in a production environment that you're going to ignore those anyways, right? But if you were to say, hey, we put you in a pretty neutral environment, we put these attacks out there, can you detect them? Yes. So how does that help you? It helps knowing that you can have visibility, and you got to figure out how to deal with that, but it doesn't necessarily help you with the threats specifically, right? But one thing I did really like was, so it was this, you can go to the results, and they had two main scenarios, right? They called it Carbon and Snake, and they basically were two different attack chains that they kind of evaluated. But you can like pick an attack chain, and then you can pick, I'm just going to pick the first one. I'm not picking on anybody, but it pulls up and you can kind of see it, how they did per attack, right? Did they miss things? Did they get things? That kind of thing, right? But
Can
what
you
was
click-
really,
Oh, sorry. Can you go up and click sign that real quick? Just curious to see the difference between that and sign it.
Not side by side. Oh, they do.
so they're side by side, right? So you can see they scored higher. Well, this one only says 10 of 11, so I don't know if they got 100%.
Ooh.
No.
But, yeah, I don't know.
Pick configuration change too, if you wanted to see how they did with or without
Right.
it.
So that's the other thing is, I don't remember what button it is. Is it this one? Yeah.
It's a great website though. Like I love the detail on this. This is cool.
Yeah, so you can, what's great if you own these tools is you can click the configuration change button, and you can actually see, is my tool configured like theirs are to get 100%? So you have something to measure against.
There's
right?
a value.
Right.
There.
So you can say, hey, if I'm gonna get 100%, I can configure it like them. But if I do that, what does that mean in my environment? Is there a lot of noise?
Right.
So that's one thing. The other thing that I really liked was, if you can see these screenshots, I mean, they're not gonna be super clear from people looking on, but there are screenshots, and I wonder if I think I can blow one of them up, right? And it shows what that detection looks like in tool. So then you can kind of see what is the information does a tool pull back, and for each specific technique that detects. And as a threat hunter, I love screenshots, because I feel like I can pull so much information out of a screenshot, and there's technical detail that if I'm able to actually squint my eyes, I'd probably figure out how to make that bigger for myself. Even looking at this, I can dig into it. There might be some technical data that I can build for myself if I don't have this tool, or I can figure out what I need to do to maybe tune this so I can benefit from this detection.
So this TTP right here is phishing.
Right.
The tactic was phishing. What was the sub technique or whatever?
So they talked about, he clicked in an email link, and it talks about what he did. He downloads basically an NTF version exe. Then he goes into, he executes it manually. Then it's an obfuscated file. So basically it has an embedded installer in the resource section in the file.
If we talk about hunting versus detections, where's the difference here, right? So these are around, are they picking up those indicators of compromise based on Turla, based on their TTPs and techniques? Or it's not broad.
This is where you're going on a very good point, in which we talk about is, yes, you can build detections for things you want to hunt for, behaviors, but when you do that, you end up with a lot of false positives, because you're pulling on common behaviors shared across environments. So some of these things, user execution, I know that's what that's called, and it talks about executing something from an email. So you might be able to go off of Outlook executing something as a parent process, but how often is that going to happen and be benign, right? So it might be better to hunt for that behavior than it is to say, I want alerts every time Outlook opens a document. might not be great to alert on, right?
Right. So in this evaluation, is the detection Outlook opening something else? And were there also thousands of other events? Because here's the problem with this. This is a clean lab without any
Really
other
clean,
data.
yeah.
Right? So there's not other traffic flowing in. There's not users using that platform on a daily basis. And so if they were literally just tracking Outlook opening something else and no traffic was going through that environment, and then that happened, cool, you have a detection, awesome. But if you had that in a financial organization, and then you started to run this process and this evaluation, it's going to blow up your system. That's going to be hundreds of thousands of alerts in that time span. And how do you weed through that? So that's why I feel like this whole evaluation was a little disingenuous, because it was a clean lab, one attack, at least from what I understand from the documentation. And as you know, Alex, we set up labs and environments, and we try to mimic real world activity as much as possible. It's a hard problem to solve at scale, especially when you're talking about this kind of activity. So, I mean, you need that benign data flowing, or else it's going to be, oh, we can detect against Outlook opening something. Because if there's no other traffic, we win, right?
The good thing is it establishes what kind of visibility some of these tools have, and some of these techniques like Outlook executing something. If that's, I don't even know if that's the real detection behind the scenes, but if that is detection, like great, you can see execution, so you know the tool can do that. But if there was some more advanced technique, you're like, oh, I didn't know that this tool can pick up on these, underlying things that a lot of other tools I didn't know that they can pick up on. So I think people are misusing the information, which is a common thing, right? Especially when you get these reports, they can give you scores like 100%. I think they should have found a different way to score so that you didn't have like this pass fail, because we're all brought up with like, oh, 100% is perfect, and 70 is barely passing, and there's already a way we think about scoring that way. We should have just done something more categorical, or just weighted rates or whatever, good, bad, ugly, I don't know. But so the data is fascinating, and people should really look at the report, but it should not have been leveraged the way it was in social media from the vendors themselves.
I mean, yeah, that website's amazing. And to your point, if you go in there and click the tools that you have and run through this and see the screenshots, the TTPs, the information available, the configuration changes, that's amazing, right? But also for tools like, I'm curious on the configuration chain side, because things like a CrowdStrike or an EDR and XDR, typically there's not a lot of configuration changing you need to make for those type of environments, right?
Let's pull it up. Let's see.
Alex, like if you deploy a CrowdStrike, like you can turn on policy, but typically you want a lot of that on. And it's interesting that you might have configuration change, right? So product description, configuration. Yeah, it's just enable everything.
I was gonna say it's everything all.
Don't turn off anything.
Yeah.
Which I don't know from your guys' experience, when you enable everything, is that a good thing in a production environment? Do you run into issues there?
Alex, what do you got?
I mean, you get a lot of noise. That's for sure. And wading through everything when you're trying to search for something, it's a little tougher, but it does give you that real world, type of feel.
So that's why I like, if you have a tool, I know some tools, and this is where this is gonna disclose my bias, black box versus not black box, right? If I looked at this and I saw what a tool is capable of, and I can see what it can detect, but I know that I can go in and tweak things, so that I'm like, okay, I like this detection, but for me, I need to tweak it so that it's not loud and proud. That I can use. But if there's a black box tool that's basically, it's a binary enable, disable, I would hate that capability, because it's like, I really like what this is looking at. I have no way to control it other than just turn it on or off.
I'm gonna, if Microsoft is listening, integrate Sysmon. Just integrate it, have some toggles to turn stuff on, please. Because I mean, that's exactly what you're talking about, Scott. Like the ability, and Alex, we deal with this all the time in our lab, to be able to toggle things off and on when you need to. So if there is a new actor that is looking at a registry key, that we find the intelligence ahead of a CrowdStrike putting that in place, because what they do on their back end, you have no control over. You can deploy Sysmon and say, I want to look at these registry keys, right? And you've done it, right, Alex? So you deploy new configurations based on the things we're looking for from a hunting perspective.
Yeah.
It's easy for us to do. Again, as security engineers in the past, we could do it, but a large org, them just deploying Sysmon is an issue, right? But it gives you that tailoring to be able to turn things off and on to protect yourself and grow that standard visibility document. Basically, you're documenting visibility in real time, right?
Right.
So
Here's another great point that I think you're making me segue to different points, but one of the things that working in the security operations in general and working with management, you get asked the question, what kind of coverage do we have if an attack comes out and things like that? I mean, we like it because we build our own content, so we can say what we can or cannot cover on. But when you have a black box solution, how do you give that answer, right? How do you say, hey, this covers against 9 of the 7 things, 7 of the 9 things, I said that correctly, that this actor does, when you just know that the tool, you're just going off of faith, right? Our tool should catch this because it's really good and we pay a lot of money for it. Like, that's not a good place for a security person to put their name on, and it's not a good place for management to say, well, that sounds good, that's reasonable, right? So that's another problem with these black box type things, is how do you evaluate your tool versus a threat without being able to emulate exactly what they do and test it?
Cybersecurity insurance is the problem, and that's again a whole other topic. We're gonna get into the MGM thing later, but I'm curious to see who their insurance provider was. But again, everybody has cybersecurity insurance, I hope. But in that, there was like, hey, do you have an EDR solution installed?
Oh, but there's a lot of checkboxes. Yeah.
Cool. But that doesn't really define your protection, right? And so you get into, it's a weird space right now because it's hard to get granular enough to understand that you're protected. You have to kind of go at that high level pie in the sky situation. So, and yeah, it's again, this website's great. I'm not in this article. I think this process is amazing.
It's a must-have.
Yeah, but what they're doing though is they're alleviating some of the stress of cybersecurity people to evaluate the tools in a POV or POC perspective.
I think they're taking away some of the accountability for some of these vendors, right? Like, hey, if you can pass this, then you basically can say we're done, right? Versus saying, no, you're displaying what your tool's capabilities are and what you have to offer and what your tool can kind of just do in general, right? Not that, hey, if you have our tool, we'll stop all threats.
So if you go back to that heat map real quick.
Which one's the heat map? This one?
No, I'm sorry, the SC magazine post.
Yeah.
So I would actually trust the vendors in that cluster more than the vendors in the upright.
Yeah,
so
like, based on how
there's a lot of vendors in that cluster that basically had the same response to this. I wouldn't trust the ones in the upper right because I feel like that is not.
So I like a lot of the vendors in the upper right though, right? As far as like what I could do with them. So like, I mean, that's true. Like I feel like
Cybereason, Palo Alto, Signet. I'm talking like the extreme upper right. I'm talking like that.
No, I know. I don't want to name names because I don't want to have biases, but like there's some cool tool capabilities that I do appreciate that some of these like top dog vendors have. But I mean, every Goliath's got its David, right? So it's just one of those things.
Anyway, I don't want to get canceled on this podcast by talking crap about security vendors. So we'll take a step back. We'll pass it over to Alex next.
Yeah. Segue.
Good
segue.
Beep that out.
So Alex, what do you got for us?
Yeah. So what I brought to the table, I found a little interesting. I saw yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago. Stems from an article that Dark Reading posted. It references a blog from Abnormal Security highlighting the impact of generative AI in Nigerian print scams, that everybody gets. Long story short, me, you guys, a lot of the listeners I know, the Nigerian print scam is one where an anonymous email is sent to a victim from a person of Nigerian nobility. being wronged and robbed, the whole spiel. And in it, they're promising to repay the person in a large sum of given financial assistance. So, give me this and I'll give you that type of thing. Sounds kind of crazy, but it's working in some capacity because they're still happening and still being sent out. The majority of people would typically be able to spot the spelling and grammar errors that immediately throw up red flags, like, oh, they spelled my name wrong. Like they call me Alejandra for some reason or something like that. But the article talks about generative AI starting to be used in eliminating those spelling grammar errors and making them more effective to a degree. And in retrospect, the article mentions that there was a researcher, interested what you guys think about this, that said that the errors and red flags that are in it actually serve as a way to getting rid of the people who wouldn't fall for it. And that the true target they have are the gullible people to begin with. So, I mean, it kind of makes sense, but yeah. So my take is it makes sense that they would be using it for their advantage. If it's not their first language or their second language, even, I can see AI filling those gaps and making them more believable. And the question I started going to is, in a general sense, do you think generative AI would be able to make campaigns and malware stuff more effective? Like this simple example. Yeah, I don't know what you guys thought.
I think, all right, here's my quick example. I just now kind of ruminating on this. Like, you have an amazing corpus of data on Facebook and LinkedIn about personas, how you think, how you talk, how you act. Instagram's great too. So you imagine if you can scrape every post that a person made on LinkedIn and build a profile against that individual, and then leverage that individual's voice, you could do some things, right?
Yeah.
Especially via email. Again, if you're not looking specifically at the from address, and they obfuscate that who is actually sending that information, and you can sound like that person in that email. That's the thing that we've seen phishing emails across our 10 years of experience. Yep. And it's always those ones like, hey, I'm the CEO, I need a gift card for $800, go to this place. Like, that's not how that person talks, right?
Yeah.
But if you get an email that says, hey, and it can talk in that voice because it can have that corpus of data, how they post on LinkedIn or their social kind of personality, that gets scary, right?
Yeah, it's exactly what CISO Vince is talking about. Basically saying using LinkedIn is just like your way to build those things.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, Mike, did you get my $500 gift card that you asked for?
I did. It's in the mail.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just checking.
Expired. Routing account number is written.
So,
Gotcha.
It was interesting when you threw this, and I was reading through some of this, and the Microsoft reacher who posed the question, why do Nigerian scammers say they're from Nigeria?
Yes.
Right? It was like, that response was, well, they don't want to waste their time on people that aren't gullible. And I was like, yeah, what a brilliant move for efficiency, right? Like, I don't want to have to go back and forth because, like, I'll tell you, I mean, you guys have seen it. When I get hit with those spam type stuff, I'll try to talk to them and make up crazy stories, and I share them with the team, and I make it, kind of entertaining for at least myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, for us too, man.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a campaign. We spent basically like a couple of hours running this guy through the ringer about gift cards, and like it was amazing. It's fun to watch. It like we needed to post on Reddit or something. Like it's so great.
So yeah, there is that I really just kind of love to kind of understand, like, these guys, like, you feel like they have all the time in the world, but they must not, and they must spend a lot of time sending these things out, and they don't want to waste their time either. But you talk about generative AI, I think it can help build things for sure. But when you have something specific, so I remember reading an article, must have been like a month or two ago now, where they were trying to use ChatGPT and how well can it discern phishing emails in general. And they're like, oh, it can detect them, but the false positive rate's still too high. It's only like 80% accurate. I'm like, oh, good. It's just as good as every other tool, right? Like, so like, is it really bad? No, probably not. But when you get very specific as far as what you want to detect, so like, say you want you want to get an AI model or a language model to target this specific type of scam, I think it would be very good at it, right? Because it's very specific. It'd be like, okay, so you have someone who's asking for money from a foreign country, and it's over a certain amount, or they make it seem like you win something but you have to move money. Like it can probably, you can teach it to discern those things. So I think there's value, like, okay, maybe they can get better with writing these phishing emails and scams, but we can also get better with very similar technology. And, you know, just like if you were to see these emails, you know right away they're a scam, right? And and so if you could do that, then for something this specific, then so could something like a language model. And people seem to be more receptive of having something like Skynet read their email versus say you and me. Because it becomes personal if you can read their email, so we can't protect them that way. But I think that's a viable solution. But you'd have to have almost a language model for different types of attacks, right? So that might be the burden there.
Has anybody's family member been hit with this Nigerian scam?
My mom.
Oh, I just remember, back in the day, man. I remember this used to blow people up, and you'd hear these stories like, what? Yeah.
It's you know, we always so us in IT, cybersecurity, engineering, our parents leverage us for all things IT.
Yep.
Right. And so like my mom, and not to call her out, I don't know if she listens to the show, but they're now starting to send just text messages to the phone about, hey, Mexico cured COVID. Click the link to find out. Right. And like they're not getting as egregious on the subject or the topic. So like now if you see Nigerian prints, you're like, oh, this is a, you know, it's been around long enough where I feel like they should stop with this kind of campaign.
Switch it up.
It's the worst. They said they made like 700 million or something.
Yeah, they're making money. They're not going to stop.
Or 700K, 700,000 or something. I don't know where they got that number from. But it's interesting the shift to things that you can hit target markets and be like, hey, if they can find the data, and there's been plenty of government data that's been exposed to say, this person took the COVID vaccine, let's send them information about COVID. They're probably going to click the link.
So that's what always interests me is some of the scams that I've seen or know people that like are close to me that have been hit by, like the attacker knew more than just like, I'm going to try to trick you with some generic thing. And an example of this, I saw this happen a lot where, for instance, people are calling parents and grandparents from, you know, impersonating somebody saying, hey, I'm stuck in jail. I need money. I got in trouble. I'm stuck here, whatever. And while that was going on, that person was in the air on a flight. So they can't call that person because they're trapped in like a 3 or 4 hour flight. So there's no way to like verify. Right. And so it's like, gosh, that's crazy to think that what information did they scrape or have access to, or what was breached that wasn't disclosed to give them that information to run those scam campaigns. That always blows my mind because you never hear like, oh yeah, Delta was breached and all their stuff was going. And it's like, well, that information got disclosed somehow because that's not just random, right? It's not so perfectly planned, right? So
I'm thinking about another time about talking about automation and being able to just set that up to run, and you just sit back and like all of that happens immediately and automatically based on the data. Whew, I'm glad I'm on it for like the pure side, right?
I think there's a lot of talk about automation later for sure.
I think there's a lot of cybersecurity people who could like go the dark route, right? The dark side of cyber and make a lot of money, but it's been amazing to see the community and the people like we're all trying to make this space better, right? So Alex, were you involved in helping with the scam? Have you been involved in any of these type of scams? Like
no, I haven't, thankfully. I mean, other than my mom asking me about this text that she got, and she clicked on it and wanted to know, actually, speaking of the jail thing that you're talking about, my mom got one about one of my sisters, being in jail. She freaked out and like called everybody thinking that she was in jail. So she was like, where do I send the money? I'm going to send the money and stuff like that. It was like 4 or 5 years ago. And man, it's, I guess I was on the receiving end to a degree because I had to go to her phone, delete it, and actually flipped it over because she clicked a bunch of different links. I was just freaking out and hitting everything. I don't know.
Yeah. But I guess that's the benefit. And when these things happen, I have to realize that we've been trained for however many years to understand these indicators. And there's people who have not been trained to understand these indicators.
It's like, so I use the example, like pick any sport you want. I'll use basketball. It's like saying, hey, I'm going to take someone who's never seen the game, put them on the court and expect them to know how to dribble, how to shoot, and how to do all these types of things. And we're
Right.
like blown away that like they can't do it. And you're like, no, but we've been exposed, we've been part of the game for so long, it becomes second nature for us, right?
Right.
And you have this person over there who's like kicking the ball, and you're like, you kick the ball? Like, what are you doing? You know, so it's
You had to bring up basketball, huh?
well, yeah, it's just it's the dominant sport where, you know, I reign superior on the team. No big deal, but
yeah, Scott, we're gonna run back that game eventually.
Oh man,
when
your health, man. I don't know.
Getting better. I'm getting better. I'm running now. We'll get there.
So I don't know. Any other things we want to touch on as far as that goes, or we want to jump to some of our discussion topics?
Yeah, let's go through the discussions. I think that was great. I mean, we covered down basically an hour of topics. And I think now we're moving into more of just like the high level discussions that we want to talk about. I believe I'm up first.
Yeah.
Okay. So this topic is centered around patch management, and it's the elephant in the room when we talk about cybersecurity, large organizations, protecting yourself. It's an ugly baby, right? There's IT team, security team, there's a lot of teams involved in this process. And there's a link there, Scott, if you want to post. IBM has a really good breakdown of what patch management means, how it relates to different environments, what it is to patch, and effectively it's centered around vulnerabilities, bugs, 0 days, anything that can cause unwanted access to a host or a potential vulnerability to a host, and the ability to patch that in a way that does not bring down the business unit that you're in effectively. So at a high level, you want to be able to patch something, correct an issue or a bug without taking down downtime, right? Without affecting that business unit's ability to make money or affect the overall business operations. So that's where it gets tricky, right? So if we talk about large orgs with 5,000 endpoints across different business organizations, there's a Microsoft patch that comes out, typically Patch Tuesdays. Most organizations will wait till like a Thursday or Friday to actually patch the next week in case there's any issues. To roll that out across that large scale is hard to do, to do that often and immediately. To test and validate and to make sure that that patch isn't going to break down infrastructure, to make sure that that user is not going to effectively lose hours of work and time to be able to work. And then to roll that patch back if there's an issue. So all that goes into this concept. It's freaking hard to do.
And think about like remote work, managing that on top of it. If something breaks,
even harder. Yeah.
Right.
And I feel for those IT people, those engineers, Alex, we've been in these people's shoes that have to manage these large organizations, roll these patches out. But it is crucial to being able to protect against the things we've been talking about for the past hour, right? Yeah. Long-standing vulnerabilities or bugs, or the 0 day is a different concept, and we can talk about that later. That's an unknown that happens, and you need to be able to react quickly and responsively. But again, you have to be able to trust those environments to be able to roll those things out in a staged manner. Dev, test, prod, kind of using the same development methodology that most developers use to be able to test, roll back, QA those tests. It's a beast. And Alex, you've done this for a while. I mean, we worked together at Foreground. We moved on and kind of ran a different team somewhere else. But like your experience with patch management, love it, hate it, indifferent. What do you got?
I mean, I love it if everything's working right? And I think the biggest thing is identifying that baseline. I mean, it's great to have that baseline, get everyone to a certain level. But maintaining that baseline is probably the hardest thing in the world. And, priority patching, finding, X, Y, and Z getting patched before others. I'm going to talk about a little bit in automation, but because it helped a lot in this, in this instance.
Absolutely.
But I don't know if I said I love it. It's necessary.
I think we're talking about specifically the operating system right now. I'll talk about Windows, there's Linux, Mac OS.
Oh man, the third-party stuff is
that's
even
where it gets tricky. So
That's
if
when
I
it gets tricky. You're right.
Windows, call it 11.
Yeah.
Now I have compatibility issues across key business software that I might not be able to update, or they haven't updated in time. So there's a weird delta. It gets very tricky. And what's really interesting about this patch management is now that it's starting to get rolled up in the EDR solutions.
Yep.
Which makes sense because you already have an agent on the host. Let me go ahead and manage that host using that agent, like CrowdStrike has it. I'll call them out, where you don't have to stand up a specific SCCM platform that's a Windows.
Well, there's an advantage to that too, because those EDR platforms have visibility to installed software. That you usually have to get third-party solutions to then get that visibility already, right? Unless you have some homegrown, you use some baked-in scripting stuff that you're savvy with, right? Which a lot of people don't build that way.
Absolutely. Scott, you've dealt with it, I'm sure.
So it's funny, like I've always been, because patching, when you look at a lot of the security protection reporting or whatever, like patching is like one of the top things. If you can't do anything else, patching is one of the most important. That's like they always say, and it's been reported anyways, and it has some ground to it. And it was interesting, I was watching the poll that we pushed out, and for a while there everything was sitting at ones across the board, and I was like, man, everyone kind of feels indifferent about patching, and then it changed, and now most people say they have major challenges, which I feel like that's how a lot of people feel, because it's a complex problem. And this is kind of why I think it's a complex problem for everybody. So I'm not trying to oversimplify it and say that everyone's wrong, because it is a complex problem. But we're trying to solve patching with a single process. And I feel like the bigger the organization, the more they have to say, we can't have this dynamic process based on how assets are categorized and how assets are used and whatever. They try to say, we're going to manage it in this one monolithic way. We're going to make sure everything is all going to hit this baseline. We're all going to do these types of things. And so what ends up happening is you have this one size fits 20% solution, right? We're like, all right, we're really good at patching these things. There's some things that lag behind. We run into some problems, but I think what I've learned, and I've looked at a lot of organizations and a lot of people that talk about their business and how they patch and their success stories, and taking away their success stories and kind of building that into like, hey, if I were to build a program for patching, how can I leverage their success for a piece of my program, not replace my program because apparently theirs works better. And an example, right? So I remember there's one, it's a smaller business, so obviously size and scale, dramatically changes your solution here. But they just kind of gave up on the manual patching process, and they basically said they're going to auto patch every end user system, right? And obviously, I don't think they did it in waves necessarily where they had, but obviously I would probably say, okay, if my organization is big and I'm looking at end user machines, especially Windows kind of made it simple, right? You can't like pick and choose your patches as much anymore. It's like cumulative.
How do you go back to? So keep going, but like rolling back that patch if something gets jammed.
Well, so and the reason why I say this is because one organization that said they did this, when they calculated the hours that it took to fix an issue versus manually do patching and monitoring for this, they actually realized they saved time fixing the one catastrophic issue a year than they did manually patching everything, throughout the year, right? Which is kind of a weird. I mean, obviously, if something goes down that is your revenue maker, that's not acceptable, right? But when you can identify things you can automatically patch, where you can potentially save that time and only have to address IT resources once every year or 2 years, that actually might be a cost savings. That you don't realize because the pain point everyone feels, right? Like no one wants to go through that. And then maybe you come up with not so much the process on how do we manually patch everything, we come up with a process for how do we deal with break fix issues, and maybe you mature that, right? So that was like an idea, right? That's one of the things. And then the other is looking at, instead of patching based on vulnerability specific scores or system criticality, maybe you do like a category based thing, right? Like where does the system sit as far as exposure, which I think a lot of people do. Like if things are exposed on the edge, like we patch those things first, which I think is great strategy. That's something that should be maintained. But the classifications could also be like, is the system openly accessible across the network? Like any host can get to it. Or does it perform a specific function that is a critical function, like it deals with authentication or communication across the business or networking in general? Or is it a specific app, and how's that app critical? That kind of thing. I think when you start prioritizing and categorizing things like that, that kind of helps in your approach. And I know people build this in the patch management programs in general, but there was a study and it was interesting. And I think it was like the Aurora vulnerability, if I'm remembering it correctly, but basically CISA, they were really proud that they were able to get that whole thing patched based on their visibility of organizations that had things that were vulnerable in 6 months. Or was it 6 months or 6 weeks? Maybe it's 6
sounds like a long time.
Yeah, I think it was. I'm going to say 6 weeks because I think that's more accurate. And it wasn't terrible, but it was kind of like we got to address this major issue that it was like a critical infrastructure thing.
Sure.
There was one organization that was able to do it within 10 days across the entire organization, and it was a sizable organization. And what was interesting, their solution to the problem was they just baked in a cultural change based on giving people scores on the systems they owned. And what they found was when they rolled this program out saying, hey, your system is at this level, so you score like a B or a C, they made sure not to score anyone low off the rip, because psychologically they found that if you have an A or a B, you want to maintain it. But if you already are sitting at an F, a C, or D, you're like, well, this is just a waste of my time, right? Like, and so what they did when this so they had the system already in place and rolling out, and what they would do is they would rank and risk their things that need to be patched, and people can look at some dashboard they made as far as what would be the most impactful thing to raise my score. And so when the Aurora thing rolled out, that was the most impactful thing, and they can say, hey, yeah, if you don't get this patched by the next reporting cycle, you're going to drop like a whole letter grade. Everybody saw that. Everybody took it as a priority to patch. Like, they didn't have to do much communicating. They didn't have to do much prioritization. And it was funny to me because I hear that story and I hear like everyone complains that patching's so hard and it's going to break things. And then all of a sudden with that system, everyone's like, I want a patch. So they make it happen and it doesn't break things. Like some of that is like,
That's super interesting, right?
Yeah,
it's
I like that.
Psychology of why you need a patch. Because if I'm in accounting and I have my report due 2 days from now and I have to patch, and I don't know why I want to patch or why I need to patch, I'm gonna be less reluctant. I'm gonna be more reluctant to patch, right? Because I need to get my work done in that time frame. But if I know as a culture as a whole, from a scorecard perspective, as you're talking about, that if I don't patch, there's a potential for my department, the overall organization.
It makes it personal, right?
The person, yeah. I don't want to be called out. I'm gonna be singled out to be like, oh, that guy didn't patch, so like he's the reason why. Like that guy from MGM. Again, we'll have that conversation a little bit. I feel bad for him, whoever he is. He's struggling. Yeah.
So yeah, I just think there's interesting solutions, and I think our problem with patch management today, because environments have gotten more complex, especially with more cloud-based things, more remote things, more SaaS, more whatever, right, is we can't have this sledgehammer solution where it's like, hey, if things are so far behind, we have to patch because it's a timeline thing. Or we have things where we only patch critical things and everything else gets in the time. Like there's got to be more intimate, if lack of a better term, way to address the issue. And I don't necessarily have the solution for that, but I can just speak to the solution that a lot of people use today clearly don't work. But we still take everyone else's solution and say, hey, this is kind of the business standard. So as long as we do this, we're not the worst, even though you're not improving or moving the mark, right?
I think, and so we had Ripside make a statement that threat actors look for those older, lower severity vulnerabilities because everybody wants to patch critical high.
Absolutely. I 100%
agree with that. On the low, right? And so, we don't worry about low. Let's just get the critical high. But if I'm gonna, you can still manipulate those lows and those mediums to get access.
Oh yeah, I think right? I've talked about it on here before. The pwn to own competition. It's it's about breaking out of hypervisors and sandbox web browsers and even devices. And almost every single one of those attacks is using a few mediums and low vulnerabilities in combination, and they're able to achieve what a critical might do, right? And that's the problem, is we've become so inundated with vulnerabilities in general, and we've come accustomed that, hey, lows and mediums are okay, or they're acceptable risk, without actually understanding what that means.
Do you think critical high, medium low, so you think that actually correlates to the ease of exploitation and the maturity level you need and the severity of exploitation if that were to happen? But like, I feel like the lower scale, medium and low, means you need to understand how to leverage those to effectively utilize those in an environment. So the ease of use might be high, but it still could be critical as far as the exposure if those are actually leveraged.
That's another reason why I don't like the CVS scoring, because I think they do a great job categorizing vulnerabilities, but the score really should be down to the organization based on the asset, which takes a lot of time. If you got thousands of assets, how do you risk and rate all those? But like, if you have literally a device, theoretically it's air gapped and it has 1,000 critical vulnerabilities, do you need to patch it, right? Or do you need to spend your time versus something else, right? Like, it's like, that's where organizations need to have a way, based on their priorities, their business models, their processes, on what is really important, how we manage that. But also there's the segmentation piece, right? Like, if you're not gonna have time to patch everything and you're gonna prioritize critical things, you got to make sure things that aren't being maintained can't talk to things that are being maintained, right? Like, there's like that sort of zero trust ideology, which I still don't like the whole zero trust ideology, because if you did true zero trust, everything would break. But you know, like the concept, right? Like, that's where you start getting into that mantra of, hey, how do we control what communicates where and how? So yeah,
I think we do a really good job of that, because I know Alex and I talk about that a lot. We see these vulnerabilities pop and we're like, all right, so is that system exposed? It's 18 layers deep in a VPN, an infrastructure that has no outside access. Nobody's going to hit it. You know, I remember a couple of years ago, Docker, as that was growing in the space, there was a root remote execution vulnerability. I'm like, yeah, well, if your Docker host is exposed to the internet and they can get access to the host, cool, you can exploit it. But like, you have to do 15 other things to actually exploit that thing underneath. But if I already have root access to the host, I can do a lot of other things than expose Docker, right? Like, it doesn't take into the logic side of the exploitation. It's just the impact and severity, as Shimoni, I think I said that right. Sorry if I butchered that, but you're talking about
impact. Yeah. So it's one of those things too. Like, I hate that I'm going to contradict myself a little bit, because almost most of the pen tests I've seen that have been successful, once they get in, is they find that system that has not been maintained and somehow leverage some authentication that is legacy version, so it's dumbed down and they can break credentials, or they can gain access and then leverage who logs into that periodically, and you know jump around, and becomes almost a pivot point or a beachhead in some way. So like, there are issues with leaving things behind. So I think you need to have standards for like, hey, after so much time, we have to bring the baseline up, like you're talking about, Alex. Like that old mentality, I feel like there is that baseline you have to move, but how you move it, I think, is what people need to work better at, right? What pieces do you move first? I mean, it's a chess game. That's what cybersecurity really is. What pieces should you move to take away that advantage so that you can still maintain and manage without pulling your hair out and ending up like all of us without hair? So
is this the bald podcast?
It really is. I just noticed that.
I was going to say, you're wearing a hat, Scott. You're not showing off.
I did well.
I love it. We got to rename this Out of the Woods. It's like the cyber podcast or something. We'll figure it out. We'll workshop it.
Yeah.
Workshop. Cool.
We'll go on the logo.
Yeah. I think Alex, you're up.
Yeah, it's hot topics.
Yeah. So for my topic, I'll be touching on automation, which we've talked about, a decent amount of times already. Favorite word of mine from what I've been doing. So it's been used to, create systems and processes in an environment to take out the heavy lift and manual operations, giving more time to do more important stuff, in general. Use of solutions like, Ansible, Terraform, Puppet too. I think Puppet's one of them, right?
Yeah.
It's huge in a day-to-day. For example, what Mike was talking about earlier with patch management, that's a huge thing. Building off of that, allowing an administrator to get systems patched, installed, and modifications, getting all that done quickly. A good example is when we first started with, the solution that we use. I had to manually update things to, uninstall, reinstall, do the whole kit and caboodle, what you want to call it. And it was time consuming.
So break that down a little bit. So like we run a lab at Cyborg, right, with a number of different hosts, different configurations, different levels of patching. It gets complicated as we're trying to manage tools and hosts and users and all of that, right? So
users being me when I complain. Users being me when I'm like, hey, can you do this? I need this. Can you figure this out? Yeah.
Snapshots, right? Like all of that. So I guess break down, like not going into detail, but how leveraging automation kind of help with that flow.
Well, it helped because the VM environment, like you said, we have so many different machines. And we have specific ones like Windows-based, Linux-based, and with automation, was able to kind of click a button, focus on another task, and it creating that playbook, creating that script, was able to start it up, modify, shut down, snapshot, all that from a script, and you can customize and kind of put it together. It definitely helped in my multitask skill, allowed me to kind of refocus and everything. I don't know if that was what you were kind of getting at, Mike, because you want me to break down even more so.
And then like being able to find infrastructure as code, because that's kind of the marketing term that they threw on top of like things like Terraform, Ansible, being able to find a template. And we're spinning up lab environments in AWS for certain things where we can just define all that in a file and hit deploy, and it all spins up, it all spins down. We're able to manage that. So like that's where otherwise it would take hours to Splunk, set up the, like all of those different things it's tough.
Well, one thing to hit on that, like you mentioned cloud, the thing that I love that, cloud's all, I know what cloud is, but I've kind of avoided playing in the cloud because one, and no one wants to give me rights to anything where I previously worked because they're scared of what I might do.
You get no rights.
But second, like, we've been looking at hunt packages for cloud, right? And what's fantastic is the ability for me to basically automate or emulate based on because cloud's all API driven, right? And so now I can like automate so many things based on emulating certain behaviors and then detecting those behaviors and then doing certain things. So like that part's really cool to see tools are being built more for automation than they have in the past as well. Is kind of where I'm going with that.
Yep. Yeah. Automation's a 4-letter word for me right now.
I know you do.
You have a special place.
Yeah, it's a special place. When I hear it, I'm like, Like I say a lot of 4-letter words when I hear automation get thrown out.
Love is one of them, right? Love.
Yeah, love. Yeah. No. I think, and I was involved in a SOAR platform when the automation wars were happening. We'll call it that, right? So we had Splunk, we had Demisto, we had Swimlane, we had a lot of different tools, marketing and pushing the security automation orchestration aspect. And all of it was genuinely trying to automate the manual, repetitive crap things that analysts have to do on a day-to-day to triage alerts and get away from fatigue. And
my biggest problem with a lot of those tools, though, is I feel like out of the box, they spent more emphasis on response than any of the other things.
Because you got to think about cybersecurity and
I know. That was their selling point.
Space that we're in. It's really hard to define static use cases for every organization and define the inputs, the outputs, the integrations, those kind of capabilities. And I luckily work for a company that was able to define those dynamically and be able to build a lot of really interesting use cases outside of the phishing use case. Or I have an IP, I'm going to enrich it, I'm going to block it, which you should never do. And I've had organizations I walked into that say, hey, can you just go ahead and block the domains that have a score over 5? I'm like, absolutely not. We will not do that, right? So you have automation. I think it's important to understand the automation internally, IT, security engineering, is it at a different maturity level than I think it is at the security operation perspective. Because it's easier to find the things that we can actually codify. We can say, this machine has this amount of RAM, CPU, hard drive space connected to this IP and this domain and this network. I can define that in a file, spin it up, spin it down, I can automate that. But if you talk about security where you say, okay, I care about this TTP and this behavior against this actor, but I need to respond if it's this host or this host and not this host. And then I need to maybe block or remove from the network if it's these sets of things, but I can't do it if it's this person. Like, it gets really hard to define logically and build those workflows across cybersecurity and those response, the detect side, you know, in every step in between. So yeah, it's definitely it's a uphill battle. I think there's companies doing it right. But you have to be, I hate it when somebody says just automate it, because they don't understand the amount of time and effort it takes to build the logic and the exceptions and all that into a flow. Sorry.
So yeah, I need a break. I know. I can tell we'll get you a counselor after this. I just want to make a couple quick remarks because I want to make sure we get to our last topic we want to touch on. But basically, with my experience with automation, I've always kind of hated the automated response. And it's not that I don't think there's things we can't automatically respond to, but I've just seen more value with how you can enrich things so people can make better decisions. And that's where I feel like most of the mundane tasks are for at least security professionals are like, okay, I've got this little bit of information. How do I get more information about that thing to make that decision easier, right? And what's worse is when you don't have all the information. I've been an analyst myself where like, okay, I can say with some confidence this is okay, right? Which I always felt bad doing, but I had no information to help me make a better decision. So as you find ways to pull information in and like collect it and automate it so it's not like a taxing, like I can spend an hour and a half on this and give you a solid answer, that's something you shouldn't be doing. So that I lean towards how can you use automation to enrich and contextualize and add value. An example, so it's a little bit of story time. I remember we were doing kind of a data study on web traffic, and I had one of my analysts working on it, and I was working closely with him, and we found out that on a daily basis per day we had 8 million proxy logs, right? And we were like, okay, and we really like the enrichment of Alexa, right? If you're familiar with Alexa, they rate basically how popular a site is, and usually if something's really popular, it's less likely malicious, and that's why they have like the top 1 million or whatever it is. Yeah. Easy to grab that list, but there is an API you can pay for and get so many enrichments based on cost. By going through the exercise on how much would it cost for us to enrich the domains people are going to, we found out a couple things. One, out of that 8 million logs a day, there are only about 20,000 a day unique domains, which is significant data reduction when you want to then enrich and contextualize something, right? And then not only on that, we also found out that users kind of fall within an Alexa ranking themselves. So like someone might be using the web, and depending on how savvy they are with the internet, they might fall in like the 20,000 range because they're using popular sites. So then you can almost baseline and say, gosh, this person usually has a threshold of 20,000 in their Alexa ranking, and now they flew way out of it. Or if there's some site that has no Alexa ranking, we give it some absurd score. So, that was another thing we had to deal with. But that's where it was really cool with automation to figure out the enrichment of that. And then because, if people are curious about the cost, we're figuring out how much it would cost for us to enrich 8 million logs a day. We came with a process where it cost us about, I think, $7 a day to enrich all of our data at most with Alexa rankings and be able to use that contextual information to make threat-based decisions and find net new things that we haven't seen before. We didn't put it into production at the time, but a really cool study, right?
You guys denied $7 a day to put it into production. Budgetary issues, right?
Politics. But the other thing I want to mention is if anyone's not used to doing any automation, one of the tools we use for some threat intel based things, and it's kind of a cool tool. It's called Node-RED. I'll try to throw that in the chat here so people can get to it. But basically, it's kind of graphical, but it lets you, and it runs on a Raspberry Pi for things you want to do for like basic jobs. But you can transform, interact with the APIs. You can create a whole graphical workflow, connect things, and it's kind of easy to build with for the most part. But if there's some really interesting things you want to do with automating, contextualizing data and doing things, you can plug stuff like this. And this is one of those things where we did this project outside of our corporate tooling to be able to pull some things off, because security professionals just get things done. That's why that's how I differentiate between IT professionals. No dig on IT professionals, but
yeah, there's another one infrastructure wise called StackStorm that's really cool as well.
Is it?
Yeah,
Very
it's
cool.
they actually have built integrations across a bunch of different tool sets that you can kind of plug in. I know Node-RED is a little bit more of it's the infrastructure to be able to automate, so you're still gonna have to write the inputs, outputs, and the ability to like pass data. This one is a little bit more baked in. But there's really cool opportunities, and I think from an organization, if you can automate the less complex things in a process, do that, right? That's only going to make your life better. And there's a really cool study or a story I think I read, and I'll try to pull up the Reddit article, but somebody had automated
just putting it out there if you want to go to the next topic.
1 minute story. Somebody automated his whole morning. So if he didn't get out of bed and turn off his alarm in time, it would email the boss immediately and say he's running late. He'd walk in, like the coffee maker would turn on when he got in and sign on his desk for the 4-minute walk to the coffee maker. And like he had automated his whole workflow. So there are some cool things time back. Anyway, all right, next topic. Boom.
All right, so we're going to jump on and we're going to cover this down, the Vegas attack. So I'll kind of introduce this. The biggest thing here is, I really want to talk about what made this such a big headline, what makes it different from everything else, and what are some of the takeaways and things we should be thinking about. And, I've been thinking about this, and it's funny because people get hit with ransomware, unless it's like something that's critical infrastructure, it doesn't really get much traction. And we hear like, oh, big business hit here, and everyone kind of bats their eye like, oh, it sucks. They must have not done something right, and ransomware got them, and we kind of move on. This is interesting to me because, man, did it blow up everywhere. And I think the reason why is it actually, in fact, it impacted people, right? Mm-hmm. People going to Vegas and they want to have a good time and they're like, what the hell? This is ruining my day kind of scenario. And so it has so much more visibility than anything that we would think would be nation driven or government driven or whatever, because it's like in people's face and people can like witness it, post things about it. It's all over the place. So
MGM owns most of Vegas now. They've been buying up
they have. Yeah. So I mean, it impacted a lot of Vegas, right?
Yeah.
So there is that piece that I thought was very interesting, and I'm trying to be brief so we can be, cognizant of time here. But then the other thing was, obviously how this all got kicked off, right? They're basically saying they were seeing a lot of social engineering. We talked about this earlier, and even someone I think made a comment in the Discord about like, yeah, kind of like the Vegas thing when it came to social engineering from LinkedIn. And that was a guy was just trying to reset, or a guy called in the help desk to say, I need things reset, and provided enough information to basically say, hey, yeah, I need this reset. And they did it through Okta, which is kind of like your identity access management tool, which sounds like a great tool. It's not like necessarily Okta's fault. So I hate that, a brand gets thrown out there and then people start, questioning things. But one thing I want to point out is if you look at Okta's posting about the social engineering stuff they were seeing, they brought up some really good like stage of the attack queries. And what was great was, basically when they have access to the admin console from weird locations, or they talk about resetting some 2-factor resets and things like that for detections, and things that I think people should be thinking about in their other tools. So obviously if you use Okta, it'd be great to be doing some of these things as well. But that was something else I wanted to call out as far as the attack goes, is there are things in data and for these types of solutions that people should be looking for or reporting on or hunting for to help with these types of things that I thought was beneficial. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on was one of the guys. It actually worked with him in a Cyber Shield, but it's Aaron Rosenman, and he's the senior director at Pluralsight, and he made some comments which I thought were pretty good. And he's basically saying, this is a known ransomware group, but they're able to encrypt over 100 ESXi servers. And something up, yeah, I know. That's a lot, and you think about the infrastructure they back, and that's why so many things were going down, right? And the biggest thing he was calling out was they had to have access to a device and the credentials to basically query vCenter to determine what were the ESXi hosts in general, right? So that was the first step. And then they had to have a device, access to a device where they had separate SSH credentials to be able to connect to the ESXi management interfaces on port 22, which is SSH, right? Which isn't required, right? So
you have to turn that on. That's an enabled feature that you have to turn on.
Right, and you do that for troubleshooting, and you do that for other things, but you don't need to have that active. And this group uses this as a mechanism. So if you take that out of their playbook, they have to figure some other way to attack this or enable it, right? So it's a great way to kind of stop this specific actor. The other thing is, they recompile the same ransomware to be able to run on Linux, right? They create an ELF binary. But one of their actions was they SCP'd it over first to a home directory, and then they had to SSH in to execute it. What's that?
They had to SCP it to every single one of those hosts.
Right. So like you see a lot of those activities. Like there's things you could look for, but also there's things that even if you had SSH enabled, it shouldn't be accessible across the entire environment. We talked about zero trust a little bit earlier, and I talked about like I have good and bad and feelings about zero trust in general, but this is an example where this type of access, especially if it's a service that shouldn't be on only except for like troubleshooting type scenarios, you should definitely limit it down to how you get to it as well. I mean, and we can't, right? And we could talk about the credential problem. That's something social engineered. There's not much you can do about it after they got to that point. They did a good job social engineering. They got those credentials, but there's other ways for you to see this activity and potentially defend against it. So I'll pass it on if we have time.
They got access to Okta.
Yeah.
User account of a specific individual. I'm guessing he's an engineer at NGM. Who then...
Well, they had to sit on an Okta sensor because they dumped the domain apparently, and they couldn't crack all the passwords, and they had to sit there and sniff passwords for really high privileged accounts while they're on Okta sensor. So it sounds like they had some way to make that play, which was interesting because that took some time, but that access to the Okta stuff is where they're able to then leverage everything else. Yeah.
I mean, they missed payroll, which is crazy. Like, you're right. It affected a lot of people. High visibility. You're talking about the gambling industry, sports industry, betting industry. Most of these hacks happen, and it's like Target got hacked and their credit card system got hacked. But like, okay, I'll cut off my credit card.
You can respond to that. Yeah.
I went to Cosmo's website the other day, all the way down. Right. I was kind of pinging around, looking around. Everything was down. This one's interesting. I think I just saw an article yesterday. They're going to lose $8.4 million a day.
Yeah.
And that came out the day before. Today I saw an article that said everything's back to normal. So I don't know what they did to remediate. I'm guessing they did not have full backups of all of the VMs across all those 100 hosts that managed payroll and the systems. But
if it's virtual, I feel like you should, but that's just my take.
Well, no, so those vCenter hosts are probably in a data center somewhere. And there can absolutely be VMs, but you also have to reprovision all 100 hosts.
Oh, it's time consuming. Yeah.
It's a lot, right? And typically if you're going to use like Veeam, which is a backup solution for those hosts, you can do that. But then you have the data. So if you're encrypting ESXi, you also have access to the data stores as well, potentially. And if you encrypt those, that's a whole trickle down effect of suck. So I want to see how they remediated this, because that's going to be probably a master class in getting back up and operational within 5 days, and that's amazing. So they got hacked, but kudos to them to be able to fix the problem as quickly as they did from an infrastructure IT perspective. Yeah, I think that probably should be discussed a little bit more. And I feel bad for the guy who got popped, because holy crap.
Right.
It costs them a lot of money.
I like the poll how like one of the equal scores is what happens in Vegas is an answer because
Yep.
you know anything can happen.
Alright. That's right. Hey, 8:30, we did it. Another one.
All right. Yeah, let me close this out then. So I just want to thank everyone for joining. I know we always come up against the minute, right? But I think we have some interesting conversations, and I appreciate people's comments. Sorry if we missed someone's comments and didn't cater to them. We're trying to get better at that. That's just kind of part of the process. And yeah, if anyone knows when you're dived into a topic, it's really hard to break character to try to read things and do other things. So if you like what you hear, you know, check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or just about anywhere else that you listen to podcasts. If you leave a good review, it really helps us kind of get discovered. So I just appreciate any kind of review. That's always a good thing because the more people that actually join, the more conversation we can have even internally on the Discord. So that'd be great. And for those that don't know, we do a weekly, we call it brief, but sometimes it goes a little long, but 30 to 45-minute episode. And we typically pull 5 breaking news topics, and we try to put our spin on, you know, what we care about from a threat hunting technical perspective or from a security perspective in general. And that hits on Wednesdays when that occurs. So it's just a good like, hey, here's some quick highlights, some things to think about from a technical perspective from to some aptitude. So appreciate everyone for joining. Just had a good time.
Yeah. Alex, thanks for jumping on. This is the first time on. We'll have you back.
Yeah.
It was fun. It was fun, guys.
And then if you guys tried the drink, I think there'll be a poll thrown up. Let us know what you think. We're trying to come up with a way to maybe come up with like, here are the top so many drinks that we've leveraged through AI to create, and maybe come up with some sort of like drink cocktail recipe book for Cyborg, and people can get that, or we can distribute that however we want to do that. But definitely weigh in if you did partake. Because you know we're forced to here at Cyborg. So either way,
that's not correct. We don't force that statement.
But yeah, I love the conversations. Love everyone joining. Just happy hunting, everyone.
Yep, happy hunting. Great talking with y'all.
You guys.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Out of the Woods podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss an episode. For more information or to connect with Cyborg Security, check us out online at www.cyborgsecurity.com and follow us on social media. We'll see you next time.